I'm Cynthia Young. I am an associate professor in the Department of English and the director of the African and African Diaspora Studies program. This is the second lecture in the program series called New Directions in African Diaspora Studies, which brings cutting-edge scholars in the field to BC. And we're very fortunate to have Professor Nikhil Singh here with us today. I've been a fan of his work for a long time. I've asked Professor Devarian Baldwin to introduce Professor Singh today, so let me say a brief word about him. Professor Baldwin is an assistant professor of history here at BC. His book entitled Chicago's New Negroes, Race, Class, and Respectability in the Black Metropolis, 1910 to 1935, looks at the mass consumer marketplace as a crucial site of intellectual life. The book will be published next fall by the University of North Carolina Press. Dr. Baldwin.
Welcome everybody. How y'all doing? Good, good. I just very much so my pleasure to introduce Nikhil Singh. When I was a graduate student, putting together my dissertation committee and met Nikhil when he was a young assistant professor at NYU, I was immediately amazed by his intellectual intensity, political sense of purpose, and generosity of spirit. I did and still do see him as a model of human possibility, especially within the expanding bounds of academic hyper-professionalization. It is my opinion that these characteristics in Nikhil far outweigh the standard list of accomplishments one hears in these standard introductions. But to mention the word accomplishments, there are many. Nikhil Singh is an associate professor of history at the University of Washington in Seattle. He received his BA magna cum laude from Harvard College and his PhD from Yale University in American Studies. He has been awarded numerous awards and fellowships, out of which have come countless reviews, essays, and articles in directly scholarly and thankfully more popular formats, which directly attest to his post-nationalist dreams for organizing a socially just world. These equally as important works like The Black Panthers and the Undeveloped Country of the Left, Toward an Effective Anti-Racism, Cold War Redux, On the New Totalitarianism, The Afro-Asian Century, Rethinking Black Marxism, and finally the providential Black is a Country, Race and the Unfinished Struggle for Democracy, are unwavering in their insistence of the centrality of Black radical archives of thought and experience, and its vision of what Nikhil calls Black worldliness. This Black worldliness has continually and consistently offered a blueprint of social and political possibility, especially present in our current age of globalization, that is yet to be fully engaged or understood. Moreover, that in the face of ensuing fascisms and totalizing schemes for organizing the world that have consistently emerged in the name of liberal capitalist democracy, it is in the Black radical critique, as Nikhil so evocatively points out, in its unfinished work, that we find more universal, more objective, more expansive possibilities for building more humane networks of interaction and affiliation on a transnational scale. In fact, I'm co-teaching a course next semester with Deborah Levinson Estrada called Alternate Globalizations, and I can assure you his work will be central in our work, and equally more important, as we begin to re-educate the Boston College community about the scope and depth of African and African diaspora studies. Him coming here today to show you all its breadth is extremely important and timely. The point of all this is that as an intellectual, as an activist, Nikhil is not only writing history, he's also making it. And speaking of history, I brought an early draft of Black is the Country. And Nikhil, I want you to sign it because it will be its own valuable archive very soon. Today, Nikhil will be giving us his thoughts on race and empire in the logic of world power, reflections on the two Americas. So everyone, please join me in welcoming a scholarly advisor, a comrade, and a dear friend, Nikhil Singh.
Thank you so much. I have to stand over here because I have this PowerPoint thing. I'll try to step out and see if I can engage without all this apparatus between us. Thank you so much, Devarian, for that incredibly heartwarming introduction And thanks to Cynthia Young for inviting me and for showing me all the impressive work that is going on here in trying to build up African American studies. It's nice to be back in Boston. I have a lot of old friends, quite old friends. I won't say how old will date me. And that thing you have belongs in the trash, but old drafts. So what I'm going to try to do today is, for some of you who read some of the earlier work that I've done, you'll see some of the resonances here. But this is a bit of a new departure for me, some new work that I'm trying to do. It's juggling a few different projects, so I'm kind of at the early stages of it. I suppose if there was a big question behind what I'm doing today that sort of motivated me to begin writing this, it's the question, why is the United States torturing people today with such openness and impunity? I'm not saying this is the first time the United States government has tortured people or been involved in torture, but there's a certain kind of openness with which torture is happening, and a certain kind of public, I think, acceptance of that, or at least a lack of a public outcry. And so that was kind of the question that I was, the sort of big political question that I was thinking about when I tried to start writing this and thinking about this new project. And it kind of took me back to an old problematic in American studies. I have some of my old colleagues from American studies here, and they know this problematic probably even better than I do, having studied with one of the main sort of proponents and developers of it. But that really is the problematic of the United States as a settler society, and trying to think about what it means to live in a settler society. What are the implications for us in the present? And of course, I'm thinking here about the work of Michael Rogan and Richard Slotkin, who did pioneering work in American studies and kind of thinking about the way in which the settler colonial origins of the United States has shaped American political culture across 2 centuries. But I'm also thinking back to the work of Louis Hartz in the 1950s on the fragment societies of Australia, Canada, the United States, all settler colonial offshoots of the British Empire, and the kind of implications for national and historical development of having those kinds of origins. So those are sort of some of the background to what I'm thinking about. And then finally, I'm interested in what the settler origins of the United States have to tell us about African American history. And more particularly, where African American studies and African American politics exists in the current moment. And so those are kind of some of the big background questions. I know they're sort of abstract, but maybe it's helpful for some of you to orient what I'm doing. And the talk the title's changed a little bit. It's called Beyond the Empire of Jim Crow: Race and Foreign Policy in the Post-Civil Rights Era. I have some slides. Not all of the slides are indispensable to my talk, but I use them because I've learned in teaching undergraduates who don't like to kind of hear me drone on and on and on, that it's nice to have some visual distractions. This is obviously our Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, and it's the epigraph for my talk today. And I'm going to do a little bit of a reading of what she's saying here in the beginning, but I'll just read it with you to begin with. Across the empire of Jim Crow, from Upper Dixie to the Lower Delta, the descendants of slaves shamed our nation with the power of righteousness and redeemed America at last from its original sin of slavery. By resolving the contradiction at the heart of our democracy, America finally found its voice as a true champion of democracy beyond its shores. Rice offered this as part of a speech she gave in late October of 2005 at the University of Alabama, a symbolic site where the governor, George Wallace, had famously vowed in the 1960s, segregation now, segregation forever. Before giving this speech, Rice visited the segregated school she had attended as a girl, dramatically pronouncing Alabama light years beyond those bygone days. And she expressly claimed her personal experience as a bridge to those in the world who perceive American professions of democracy promotion as little more than hypocrisy and the arrogance of power. So while the Bush administration has generally adopted a posture of tough-minded meritocracy and color blindness when discussing issues of race, here Rice was enlisted as the administration's highest-ranking black official to claim the moral authority of the African American civil rights movement for the controversial, some would say failed, foreign policy of preemptive war, nation building, and occupation in the greater Middle East. Now, it has been rare for Rice to draw attention to her racial background. Some of you might disagree with that, but that's been my reading, at least up to now. At the same time, as the daughter of an ordained minister and scion of the church-going black bourgeoisie, she's clearly well-versed in the forms of civic religiosity and prophetic Christianity that from abolition onwards have animated black struggles for equality in the United States. Additionally, in the passage that you have before you, she adeptly draws on the rhetorical tradition that Mary Dudziak has called Cold War civil rights, in which domestic advances against racial oppression were heralded against a familiar litany of embarrassing racist incidents as proof of the superiority of American democracy and the legitimacy of U.S. global leadership in the struggle against communism. Indeed, Rice's might be considered a mature, even hyperbolic example of the latter discourse, not only because her influence and position is now presented as a sure index of racial progress, but because, unlike during the Cold War, there are today few publicly visible alternative representations of the relationship of U.S. struggles for racial justice and U.S. foreign policy. You with me? Okay. If you're not, at some point, feel free to interrupt. Coming in the aftermath of the racial embarrassment of Hurricane Katrina, controversies about falsified intelligence, revelations of torture and worsening security in Iraq, as well as another close controversial presidential election in which 90% of African American voters opposed the Bush administration, it would be easy to dismiss her carefully staged appearance as one more cheap publicity stunt. But I believe this would underestimate its meaning and its import. The stubborn political dissent of Reverend Joseph Lowery and others punctuating the quasi-state funerals of Rosa Parks and Coretta Scott King, we might just call them state funerals actually, come to think of it, made clear that the passing of members of its leading generation risked opening up all too live public contention over the meaning and memory of the civil rights movement. Similarly, Kanye West's bluntly accessible political provocation, quote, "George Bush doesn't care about black people," end quote, briefly pierced the media images of black abjection and bureaucratic infighting that added insult to the injury and devastation of New Orleans. The latter examples, however, I think are exceptions to a racial rule of the post-civil rights era, in which widening the bandwidth of elite discourse and interaction across the color line generally forecloses more radical egalitarian interpretations of racial inequality and demands for its redress. To put it another way, the political narrative of race in the United States remains too far-reaching in its implications and too unstable in its raw forms to be taken off message or to be left to amateurs. Governmental performances like Rice's, in this sense, might be viewed as official bids to enclose a messy terrain of cultural political conflict. They highlight a shared archive of contextual knowledge, in this case about the civil rights movement, only to reverse the difficult secularizing moment of doubt demanded by meditation on serious, unresolved historical and political questions. In this case, and here I do a little bit of a reading for you, Key tropes of American exceptionalist nationalism, anti-imperialism and democracy, innocence and providence, boundlessness and destiny are enlisted to align the civil rights movement with the global projection of U.S. state power. This maneuver consciously depoliticizes the domestic history of racial subordination and resistance by consigning it to the past. As Rice described Katrina's baleful effects, they were, quote, a vestige of the Old South. At the same time, her words draw energy from the historical legacy and ordinary heroism of black freedom struggles in the explicit interest of freeing the contemporary state of war from the contradictions of race and empire. In the remainder of my talk today, I want to reflect further upon how U.S. racial construction traverses the domains of the foreign and the domestic and problematizes their neat separation. I've already begun to suggest some of the ways domestic racial contexts are used to index the articulation of U.S. foreign policy. A question: how does the practice of U.S. foreign relations in turn reshape the domestic narrative and common sense understanding of race? Have the links between race and foreign policy, particularly in the arena of black-white relations, been substantially altered during the post-civil rights era since 9/11? To what extent does culturally and historically dense racial animus, rather than more recent expressions of anti-racist hope, animate the projection of U.S. power abroad? And finally, what intellectual traditions and historical precedents might inform alternative, more egalitarian ways of posing the relationship between race, justice, and power at home and in the world? So those are three kinds of questions that I hope to try to answer in the remainder of my talk. Okay, everybody still good? I'll go for about probably another 40 minutes, and hopefully we'll have a lot of time for questions. A number of commentators, many commentators actually, this is a sort of little cottage industry in political theory and American studies, plumb the contradictions between the political universalism of what Gunnar Myrdal famously called the American creed of liberty and democracy for all, and what have been regarded as provincial, particularistic U.S. folk traditions of white supremacy. In other words, how do we square this? That we have this universalistic political tradition of freedom and democracy for all, and yet this seemingly equally durable folk tradition of white supremacy and kind of everyday racial contempt. How do we square these things? This has sort of been an old problem going quite far back in American political thought. Generally, the discussion tends to be governed by an intellectual procedure which separates a good, enduring civic nationalism from a bad, departing racial nationalism. So we tell ourselves that our timeless ideals are these ideals of liberty and democracy for all, and racism is a kind of artifact of the past. I mean, Rice would call it a vestige that is sort of constantly in the process of withering away or disappearing. And many, many discussions going quite far back are governed by this intellectual procedure. And it's quite amusing to follow this forward and to say, well, that's what they said 50 years ago, that's what they said a century ago, and yet you still keep having a similar discussion. So there's a sort of a hierarchy, right, where we all always are able to reassure ourselves that racism is the minor tradition. The major tradition is the idea of liberty and democracy for all. Moreover, since Myrdal so powerfully trained his gaze on the importance of the American creed for the ordering of international affairs, few commentators consider whether the traditions of U.S. racial nationalism, qua collective racist feeling, let's call it that, collective racist feeling, few commentators consider whether this has any significant global reach or significance. Now, this wasn't always the case. I'll just show you this slide from the Chicago Defender from the 1940s. This is after or the beginning of the US occupation of Japan in 1946. And you see an African-American soldier talking to a Japanese civilian saying, I know just how you're going to feel, bub, in that sort of World War II, vernacular. And the battleship Mississippi is blaring Dixie in the background. And of course, you've got the foregrounded figure with the lynch rope and so on. There's a certain kind of political consciousness within the black press in the 1940s of the links between racism at home and its export abroad. And so what you see there is a kind of in a cartoon form, a critique of that. I just show you that to give you some idea that there is a longer tradition of thinking through these connections within the black public sphere, and elsewhere as well. But I think in the current moment we're not quite so familiar with that, perhaps, or literate with that. Indeed, the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the unprecedented event of 1946, 1945, 1946, often becomes an occasion for considering whether there is a racist motivation behind U.S. foreign policy. So people ask the question about the dropping of the atomic bomb. Was it in some ways motivated by racism? Because the Pacific War was a war so colored by racial animus towards the Japanese that people ask that question, did that sort of tip the scales in leading to the decision to drop the atomic bomb? But this generally gets closed down as a discussion. So that's one place where we talk about collective racist feeling having a kind of global import. But that discussion generally gets closed down. And you saw that a number of years ago in the controversy at the Smithsonian when the museum was going to have an exhibit on the Enola Gay and on the dropping of the atomic bomb. And they were going to show images of the Japanese victims. That was one of the notes of controversy. And veterans groups objected to this. And the exhibit basically just got closed down. They just had the plane. That's it. So there was no exhibit, no serious discussion of this issue, although there is a serious discussion among historians. Similarly, the Vietnam War, which many of you probably remember, was a war in which, against the backdrop of civil rights and anti-racist activism, was regularly, routinely described as a racist war. Yet I would submit that today we probably tend to regard the Vietnam War as motivated primarily by a zealous, if misguided, anti-communism, and or worse, as a cautionary tale about military restraint and the failure of national will. So again, I think we don't really deal with that question in relationship to Vietnam either. In fact, since World War II, the enduring rhetorical thread of every U.S. military intervention abroad is that it represents a fight against a tyranny that poses a threat to humanity itself. Thus, the wars against fascism, communism, and now terrorism all share essentially the same narrative structure of positions and habits of perception. These are epochal, civilizational struggles to preserve liberal democracy against enemies bent on imperial expansion and political domination, including criminal potentials for extermination, enslavement, or torture that mark the threshold of the modern concept of human rights. In other words, it is our enemies that are racist, our enemies who torture, our enemies who are imperialist, our enemies who stand in this space outside of a proper, humane social order. Okay? And fascism is the sort of original template for that, but that gets carried over into the Cold War and the rhetoric of the Cold War, and it's gotten carried over into what Donald Rumsfeld now likes to call the long war against terrorism. And of course, you see in this long war all kinds of rhetoric about how the enemies we're fighting want to impose political domination on us, including these kind of imperial dreams of an Islamic caliphate and things like that. All of that gets conjured within the rhetoric of the kind of war we are now fighting. I'm not saying that this is persuasive rhetoric. I'm just saying that it has a certain kind of consistency going back to World War II. Indeed, even when we admit or consider the words imperialism or empire when talking about the United States, and obviously that's become more common and more fashionable, these tend to be used in a metaphorical way or as decidedly soft power concepts. Empire light, to use Michael Ignatiev's memorable formulation. As if bracing this somewhat muted understanding for the impending violence of the invasion of Iraq, Ignatiev more recently noted that even if the United States itself presides over a kind of overseas empire, like what Chalmers Johnson has called the empire of bases, it is nonetheless an exceptional empire because it is categorically unlike those of times past, built on conquest and the white man's burden. That's from Ignatiev. And here again we observe the foundational importance of anti-racism and an imagery of racial inclusion as legitimating rubrics for U.S. global power. Just as the figure of Colin Powell was enlisted to sell the Iraq War to an incredulous United Nations, Condoleezza Rice now casts herself as a bridge to a hostile and skeptical world. The idea that the United States might engage in forms of racist or racial warfare, let alone anything we would call race war, is in this context intellectually, politically, and morally out of bounds. I mean, to say such a thing is to be a hysteric of sorts, which you might think I am at this point. And I'm not saying it yet. I'm just saying the other side. The indefensibility of such a charge is demonstrated not only by the fact of a racially integrated, now multicultural U.S. military establishment and political leadership cadre, but also by long-standing U.S. commitments to decolonization and national self-determination, including in Iraq and around the world. Okay, so everybody still with me? I haven't lost anybody. I know the people I lost hopefully left already. So, okay, so now I want to kind of sort of make another turn in the talk to think about where African Americans stand in relationship to what I've set up so far and the post-9/11 context in particular. From this slide of Powell and Rice, you see something, I think, that has been emblematic about the Bush administration, and quite important, again, about the Bush administration. From the inaugurating spectacle of its first nominating convention, which you may remember back to in Philadelphia, the Bush administration has actively demonstrated a public commitment to a politics of symbolic representation in racial matters. This appears to build upon and to carry forward Clinton-era efforts to diffuse domestic racial division as a so-called wedge issue or site of national political contention, characteristic of the presidential administrations of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Even overwhelming African-American political opposition to the younger Bush, against a backdrop of strong evidence of the systematic disfranchisement of black voters in the decisive Florida balloting during the 2000 presidential election, did not disturb the dominant conception that the U.S. has entered into an era of relative racial peace. The 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon further heightened a tendency to promote the idea of the transcendence of racial division, as African Americans and Latinos in particular were seemingly incorporated into the cultural citizenship of nationalist sentiment. A spate of newspaper articles prominently testified to a new, unprecedented comedy between black, brown, and white, including, most improbably, new levels of trust between black communities and the New York City Police Department, despite raw memories of the police killing and torture of unarmed black criminal suspects such as Amadou Diallo and Abner Louima in 1999. And this is just one article from the New York Times, which you may have seen from 2002. I've found about 6 or 7 of these, mostly from the Times and the Daily News and Newsday. And they, it just basically says New York 9/11 bridge racial divide, and then you have these nice little graphs which show the trajectories of kind of increasing racial comedy, and we could read those for a while and look at them. I put them up to you not as a demonstration of any kind of empirical truth, but just as an example of this kind of preoccupation, the idea that after 9/11, the United States had entered an era of relative racial peace. The problem, of course, is that the domestic narrative of race did not remain cooperative for very long. And, of course, how could it? The public policy agenda of the last quarter century, from the criminal justice system to education and social welfare, has moved in a consistent and uniformly hostile direction against the needs of and interests of poor minority communities. Legal citizenship, even when married to cultural citizenship, the idea of Americanness, if you will, is not today, and arguably never has been, a reliable bulwark against the forms of racial stigma and its ill social and political windfalls. Thus, as one of the earliest and most thoroughgoing liberal defenders of the Bush administration's foreign policy, Michael Ignatieff was understandably exercised by the pronounced domestic racial divisions and neglect that the images of Hurricane Katrina revealed to the wider world in 2005. And this is a longer quote from Ignatieff, and I show you this because I think he's an interesting figure. He was formerly here, I guess, in the Kennedy School of Government, right? I think he's left, right? Hasn't he left Harvard? I think he ran back to Canada after the Iraq War went so badly. But he was, a very, very prominent liberal supporter of the war. And when Katrina hit, he was a very, very outspoken about the damage that Katrina had done. And I find it very interesting the way he framed this. So I juxtapose these things as part of my interest in, again, thinking across the foreign and the domestic and how race figures on both sides. So this is what Ignatieff had to say about Katrina. He said, "The most terrible price of Katrina was not the destruction of lives and property, terrible though this was. The worst of it was the damage done to the ties that bind Americans together. The future of confidence in American government will depend not on the leaders who failed their trust, but on the foot soldiers who did not. Millions of acts of common decency and bureaucratic courage will be necessary before all Americans, and not just the storm victims, feel that they live once again in a political community and not in a savage, lawless swamp." Now, significantly, what vexes Ignatieff and commentators like him is the violence that has been done to the idea of the American creed, to come back to that notion. That is, the idea of the nation as a political community, a social contract, independent of racial, ethnic, or national origins. And thus the weakening of trust in U.S. citizenship as a space of universal social protection. In contrast to Rice, not to mention the harshest right-wing defenders of the Bush administration, Ignatieff acknowledges the contemporary, rather than the atavistic, cultural force of anti-black racism as one of the sources of this violation, of this erosion of trust in U.S. citizenship. Such recognition, however, is quickly overwhelmed by and slides almost imperceptibly into a very different type of cultural investment in the restorative potentialities of what I would call military humanism, the martial vision of citizen soldiers sent into an abject space to once again raise a civilization from a, quote, savage, lawless swamp. If one reads Iraq in the place of Katrina between these lines, Baghdad and New Orleans suddenly blur in a zone of indistinction. Again, I think the rapper Kanye West was closer to the mark and more intentional in his now infamous unscripted intervention. I hate the way they portray us in the media. If you see a black family, it says they're looting. You see a white family, it says they're looking for food. And you know it's been 5 days with the way America is set up to help the poor, the black people, the less well-off, as slow as possible. we already realize a lot of people that could help are at war right now fighting another way. And they've given them permission to go down there and shoot at us. So that was sort of a part of Kanye West that maybe everybody didn't read, sort of like a little deeper into his comments, which actually already made the connection between Iraq and Katrina in some interesting ways. In the context of New Orleans, the national narrative of racial progress, common citizenship, and militarized foreign policy turned on itself like a snake eating its own tail. From the familiar $500 million no-bid contract awarded by the U.S. Navy to Halliburton's subsidiary Kellogg Brown & Root in the immediate aftermath of the storm, to the mercenaries from the Blackwater Corporation deployed by the Department of Homeland Security to secure New Orleans' higher ground against predators from below, from the plans to rebuild the city along neoliberal lines with unprotected low-wage labor, to recent ideas seeming to be in the process of being accomplished, like permanently rezoning the city's new swamplands in order to make New Orleans safer, smaller, and whiter. What Naomi Klein has called disaster capitalism consistently brings home unpleasant comparisons with the theater of war. What few commentators fully observe, however, is that the social contexts of racializing division at home and civilizing warfare overseas are not just these uncanny parallel universes. They are, in important respects, aspects of the same economic, cultural, and political logic. So that's the kind of strong claim that I would want to make. Perhaps not ultimately a claim that you will be persuaded by the time I finish, but one that I'm sort of working to develop and show, partly because I think that this hasn't been discussed enough in the context of the way we talk about the war. And I'm not simply trying to say that this is a racist war, in the sense that I don't think the idea that saying something is racist is a simple matter. I think we've learned to sort of hear that language as a kind of banal comment, again, as a kind of hysterical or sort of hyperbolic comment, rather than sort of understanding what it means to kind of think of ourselves as existing within a culture in which a certain kind of racial project or set of racial projects continues to organize our imagination and our understanding of social life in ways that then have implications for policy. Now, in terms of foreign policy, one of the really significant advances in recent years has been to recognize the culturally embedded dimensions of foreign policy. You know, we tend to think of people making foreign policy as motivated by economic considerations, geopolitical strategy, all kinds of calculations that operate within this realm of kind of rational calculations about power and advantage and interest. But one of the things that we've begun to understand, and much of this work has been pioneered from outside traditional confines of diplomatic history, is the way in which assumptions about gender, sexuality, race, and culture more generally, the sort of cultural matrix in which policy is made, informs and shapes that policy. Okay? It's a sort of elementary assumption in many ways for many of us, but it's one that I think is still not really central to the way in which foreign policy is understood and commented upon more broadly. I've been really gratified by the fact that in recent years, some of this discussion has begun to enter into the mainstream discussions of foreign policy. So I'm thinking of work like that of Walter Russell Mead, his book Special Providence, and Anatole Levin's recent book, The Anatomy of American Nationalism. Both of them are kind of these scholar pundits, and both of their books have gotten kind of reviews in wider circles. And Mead, is a fixture at the Council on Foreign Relations and so forth. And his work, I think, is particularly interesting for sort of moving this discussion forward. One of the things that Mead has argued is that there are four key strands of American foreign policy, he says. So I won't rehearse his whole argument. But he suggests that the key strand that sort of trumps all the other ones in the making of American foreign policy is what he calls the Jacksonian strand. Okay, the other four, in case you're interested, are the Hamiltonian, the Wilsonian, and the Jeffersonian. Okay? The Hamiltonian is basically the idea that foreign policy is about commercial transactions, right? And that states are basically trying to organize commercial transactions at a wider scale. The Wilsonian is probably the most familiar, the idea that states are operating internationally to try to secure global peace. So an order. And the Jeffersonian remains a little murky to me, I have to confess. But I tend to think in threes instead of fours. So the Jacksonian, though, is the most important for Mead. And he says that this strand is ever present, and that once it emerges, it will trump the others in terms of the making of foreign policy. So this is what he says the Jacksonian is. It's less. And he also says that it's crucial to understanding the U.S. reaction to 9/11. Less a set of conceptual arguments than an arena of popular affect and communal feeling, Jacksonianism, according to Mead, crystallizes those moments when U.S. nationality and citizenship are imagined and mobilized less as constitutionalism and more as a kind of kinship. Historically, of course, the color line constituted one of the most durable boundaries of Jacksonian nationalism. In other words, the idea that we were all part of a kin, not just members of a social contract, but related as if we were kin, has obviously in American history been interrupted by the facts of racism. That's been one of the central ideas. We're not kin with those people, right? But Mead claims, and I think this is a really important claim in relationship to what I was saying previously about the idea that 9/11 changed the African-American relationship to the American polity. Mead claims that Jacksonian dispositions, forged prominently in a context of frontier warfare, have over time been generalized into a set of cultural codes around honor, revenge, communal self-protection, and rough justice that are no longer dependent upon avowed commitments to white supremacy. In other words, otherwise suspect minorities, and this is a really central claim of his argument, because he makes a big deal of this, otherwise suspect minorities, particularly African Americans, can learn and master these codes, for example, through demonstrations of martial prowess, and particularly in military service, and thus gain inclusion and membership in the nation understood as a folk community. I take this argument very seriously because I think it's important. And it is undeniable that African Americans have achieved an unprecedented centrality and acceptance and inclusion within the United States. I don't want to deny that fact. And that the military has been one of the central roots to that. Okay? And the Jacksonian tradition puts a tremendous premium on military service. Okay, and you can even narrate this back going and looking at the Buffalo Soldiers or the use of African Americans in frontier warfare and so forth. So there's even a military tradition there that can be drawn upon. Yet I really question that there is a Jacksonian constituency among African Americans. That's something that we can talk about. But more importantly, I think, Mead's insistence that the Jacksonian synthesis, as he calls it, has transcended its historic racist origins, is shallow, reliant upon, first of all, a tacit racial bargain that Indian removal was a tragic, inevitable part of the civilizing process in the United States, without any contemporary political effects, meanings, or implications, while racial slavery was a historic wrong that has now gradually been righted. In other words, he sort of splits the sort of two main organizing racial projects and kind of sort of includes African Americans while saying that it's fine that this kind of settler ethos nonetheless organizes our foreign policy because it actually doesn't really relate to anything that matters anymore because that's all in the past. This argument, which I think is unethical on its face, also studiously ignores how settler colonial ethics and historical precedents now animate both erudite and folksy defenses of Bush doctrines of preemptive war. And I just put this up for you. This is from another very important academic and intellectual, John Lewis Gaddis. And this is from his little book, Security, Surprise, and the American Experience, his sort of post-9/11 book. And this is what he says. The United States had vast borders to defend, but only limited means with which to defend them. There were as well what we would call non-state actors, Native Americans, pirates, marauders, and other free agents, ready to raid lightly defended positions along an advancing frontier. An expanding civilization spread out along an insecure frontier had the right of preemption. In responding to the horrors that took place on September 11, 2001, the Bush administration, whether intentionally or not, has been drawing upon this set of traditions. So that's just kind of one very, I think, important example of where a kind of set of settler colonial precedents is being used really to create a sort of usable past for preemptive war. It's kind of turning Richard Slotkin on his head in some ways. Now, what is more important, I think, for my argument in relationship to this concept of Jacksonianism as a central strand of American foreign policy making, and in Mead's account of it, is that he overlooks what actually constituted the historical significance of the Jacksonian synthesis in the first place, which is that it brought the regional nationalisms of the U.S. South and the West, slave owning and frontier expansion, into a single cultural and political complex for the first time in U.S. history. In other words, I'm saying you can't really separate slave owning and frontier expansion in the ways they inform a certain conception of regional nationalism in the United States, that Jacksonianism then comes to name. So Mead just kind of ignores it because he wants to actually try to cleanse the racial history from Jacksonian, the sort of logic of Jacksonianism. And I want to sort of say, if we take this, if we import this idea from him, then we actually have to take it seriously in all of its implications. As Michael Rogan observed years ago, Jacksonianism represented perhaps the first majority Southern strategy, as it sought to emphasize the interests the South shared with the rest of the country. And Rogan distinguishes between a minority Southern strategy, the idea that the South is different from the rest of the nation, from a majority Southern strategy, which says the South actually is the better part of the nation, and that the rest of the nation has more rather than less in common with the South. Now, the way that this occurred within Jacksonian democracy was to minimize the importance of slavery, which obviously was already a very divisive issue, and to nationalize the project of expansionism as an enlargement of the area of American freedom. So you already see that kind of formula at work, and that formula is kind of unintentionally at work in Mead's argument as well. Although the Jacksonian synthesis forestalled and deepened rather than resolving the conflict over slavery, it also provided a mythic model for national rebirth in the face of the race and class contradictions of U.S. capitalist development, regeneration through Western violence. So I want to say that rather than Jacksonianism, I mean, I'm sort of rehearsing this kind of historical argument, which may seem sort of obscure. I want to say, why not just call it racial nationalism? You know, I go back to my earlier point that we want to say racial nationalism is always disappearing. And I want to sort of say, no, it's a kind of co-equal tradition with the idea of the sort of liberal tradition, and that they get infused and mixed culturally, because the ground of culture is messy. So why not call it racial nationalism? And I think this remains the term that best defines the Jacksonian articulation of culture, kinship, and nationality within an ideology of American freedom. To be more precise, we might identify the decisive contribution of the Jacksonian foreign policy tradition to the reproduction of an exclusive rather than inclusive sense of what it means to be a U.S. citizen, and to the development of the U.S. as a racial state, that is, the transference of culturally or biologically derived conceptions of kinship onto the empowering abstractions of nationality and the concomitant accrual of government powers to monopolize distribution, recognition, and violence in the development of separate and unequal populations within a single space of political representation. That's the sort of more complex definition of what I mean when I say racism. Okay? Something that's actually about a process of using the state to develop different populations within a single space of political representation. So, is everybody still with me? Okay. You sure? Nod. Okay. Thanks. I'll try to wrap this up. Am I doing okay for time? Okay. I'll really try to bring this to some kind of conclusion. I have a long discussion here of how we can think of Jacksonian nationalism. Even we can take the argument a step further by thinking of the particularities of Southern development in the United States, and that one of the arguments I'm trying to engage in that section of the paper is this idea that when we talk about American capitalism, we actually need to think of it as variegated. And capitalism in general is not a monolith. There are varieties of capitalism. And we might think of the particularities of the Southern model of capitalism in the development of the United States, and that in some ways what we're seeing today under the auspices of what we call neoliberalism is the kind of fruition of that Southern model of capitalism. The idea of low wages, low services, low union protection, an emphasis upon naturalized social hierarchy, and so forth. Much of this develops, within the South before it gets kind of, a high-sounding sort of names from like the Chicago School of Economics and the Washington Consensus. So there's a sort of longer argument about the Southern model of American capitalism as the model that has now come to sort of triumph, a model that not only outlasted the New Deal and the Civil Rights Movement, but one whose preponderant values were carried throughout the country by the other great internal migration of the mid-20th century, that of white Southerners to the West and Midwest, that helped to fashion the cultural and electoral base of the modern conservative movement. And a complex matter that's beyond the scope of what I have time to discuss today is the role that the expansion of a Southern-derived white Protestant evangelical religion has played as a carrier of racial fears, imageries, and practices that were simultaneously being discredited by the Black freedom movement. Too succinctly, we might counterpose two versions of activist Christianity. One, the Black freedom movement, that challenged the durability of racial animus within the secular and materialist time of slavery and colonization through a patient counter-hegemonic practice, and the other, which has in some ways renewed forms of racial and quasi-racial identity within ethno-nationalist frameworks of messianic time, chosen peoples, and holy empires. Religion is beyond my ken in many ways. I'm making a little foray there like many people, and many of you probably are better at it than I am. But that's just sort of my little effort to think about varieties of Christianity as well, right? Varieties of capitalism, varieties of Christianity, varieties of foreign policy making. We need to think about varieties if we're going to have any hope of actually sort of redirecting this country in a different kind of direction, which is ultimately the reason why I'm going through this kind of analysis. So in light of this somewhat condensed now discussion, consider the following question. What if the damage that the racial does to our idea of civil life or civil society, those ties of fealty to creed and country that bind us together as Americans beyond creed and color? What if the damage that the racial does to the civil is part of what has cemented those ties in the first place? In other words, what if we can't really get away from it? It's an unfortunate aspect of U.S. political and intellectual culture that we are forced to keep remembering that the vaunted freedoms of formal citizenship in the United States, which aren't to be laughed off, these are important things, right? I believe in the Constitution, are supplemented by a powerful matrix of racial association and identification as a means of allocating the benefits and deficits of material distribution, symbolic recognition, and state violence. As Katrina laid bare, this creates a constitutive and insoluble set of problems as to where the boundaries of nation-state protection actually lie. Within state borders, legal citizenship provides little assurance, let alone guarantees, if the everyday life of cultural citizenship is based less on shared patriotic feeling or the notion of a community of common interests than on one or another form of imagined kinship. Beyond state borders, the racial impairs our ability to reliably distinguish friend from enemy, peaceful coexistence from existential threat. It thus also produces a sense of menace so high that no framework of treaties, international agreements, or rational efforts to balance opposing interests and concerns could possibly hope to contain it. And we're seeing some of this bubble up around the immigration issue, which I didn't write about in this. But that is a Jacksonian issue, sort of par excellence, if you want to use an example. And the Arab port issue is another example. And it's interesting to see how George Bush found himself on the other side of those issues, playing the kind of Hamiltonian to the sort of Jacksonian constituency that he has done so much to stoke and cultivate in the ceaseless invocations of the terror threat and so forth. Now, it might be helpful to think about these issues from outside the United States as well. A little over a month ago, the United Nations High Commission called for the closing of the Camp Delta prison complex at Guantanamo Bay on the grounds that the explicitly sanctioned, and here I'm talking about the interrogation practices like hooding, shackling, force feeding, simulated suffocation, sensory deprivation, including forcing prisoners to stare into intense light and wear earphones blasting loud music. The officially sanctioned, these are the ones the U.S. acknowledges that we're doing. So these are the things that are being avowed, accepted, acknowledged. The UN High Commission called these practices that are tantamount to torture that do not accede to the standards of most civilized nations. Okay? And I think probably, I would hope that most of us would agree that this is true. The Bush administration's response was a succinct and revealing non sequitur. Quote, "The detainees are being treated humanely, comma, remember these are terrorists." Okay, so remember these are terrorists is a vernacular, one might say Jacksonian code, for a sovereign state of exception within which the American people, us, are assumed to be appropriately and transparently represented. And in the absence of a significant popular outcry against torture, who can say that we haven't been so? Its precise and intended effect is to draw a boundary, that's what the little comma's for, between the humane, indeed the human, that is, we the people, that treat people humanely, and that always already elastic category, terrorist, that contains someone who may in the abstract be a person, but who has permanently forfeited the right to have rights, that is, the right to any meaningful civil protection. Now consider the all too literal prisoner's dilemma faced by racialized minorities in the U.S. in the aftermath of 9/11. If a new racial profiling of brown-skinned, Muslim-looking Arab and South Asian men and women temporarily displaced African Americans as the primary suspect population of urban policing in certain localities, it also gave new state sanction and legitimacy to policing tactics that for the first time were being actively challenged and discredited. You may remember the momentum that was developing against racial profiling in 2001. More disturbing are the well-documented links between systematic torture and brutality within the vast domestic U.S. prison complex, where African Americans comprise the majority of the 2 million incarcerated, and the degree to which these have been reproduced from the methodology, ethos, right down to the actual personnel, guards, administrators, etc. in Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo, and the expanding complex of U.S.-run prisons overseas. You know this, right? You know about like Lane McCotter, who went from running the Texas prisons or the Utah prisons to running Abu Ghraib. Of course, the low-level guards, Grainer, was a prison guard in Pennsylvania. There are countless examples like this of the sort of revolving door between domestic prisons and now the overseas prison complex, many of which we obviously don't even know about. In other words, while the terrorist, like the criminal, may theoretically be of any race or ethnicity, we must acknowledge the fact that racial, religious, ethnic, and national origin discrimination remains central to making determinations about who and who is not one, but also, more importantly, that the creation of categories of persons without rights, our ability to create categories of persons without rights, is enlivened by the narratives and practices and institutions of specifically U.S. traditions of racial warfare and collective punishment. This is just another, this is just another sort of slide that just gives you a little example. That's for an advertisement for a Boeing aircraft, which depicts U.S. soldiers rappelling onto the roof of a building labeled Muhammad Mosque in Arabic. And the headline reads, "It descends from the heavens, ironically it unleashes hell, delivers special forces to insertion points never thought possible." Again, let's just give you an example of the cultural matrix in which the sort of foreign policy imagination kind of emerges. It's sort of a crude example, perhaps, but just gives you an idea of where some of the kind of the imaginary that sort of shapes the current warfare is being developed and advanced. So, okay, now I'm really going to wrap it up, okay? I promise you. Five more minutes and I'll be done. And I apologize for going on for so long. At the end of his life, Malcolm X said that all he was really doing was, quote, helping to correct America's human problem. And I think these are words to ponder. So not America's race problem, but our human problem. And I think everybody has a human problem. It's not just the United States. And there's a big human problem when you think about how you try to live in a world where people are really different. They speak different languages, they have different traditions. You kind of want to try to stay out of each other's way sometimes as much as you want to connect and get to know people. How do you figure out to do that when you're jostling on a planet that has scarce resources and an increasingly fragile system that doesn't seem designed to preserve all of our lives, right? It's tough. It puts us all in the position of having a human problem. And I think this is where we can really turn to the black radical tradition and not even just the radical tradition, but the civil rights tradition to help us to think about ways of displacing what I think is also a particular American tradition. It's not the only American tradition, but a particular set of ways, of codes, of practices for imagining and thinking about the world and how we keep ourselves safe within it. How we can sort of try to push that aside and bring back some other kind of momentum to our social and political life. At this point, and this harkens back to where I started with Condoleezza Rice, I hope it's clear to you that I think, at least, that the Black freedom movement, too narrowly known today as the civil rights movement, is not the analog, but the near exact counterpoint to the ethos and tradition currently animating U.S. foreign policy. As Jesse Jackson remarked over a quarter century ago, despite propaganda during the Cold War, the actual Cold War was characterized by continuous and ongoing efforts by the state to isolate and challenge the audacity of black involvement in foreign affairs. When compared to figures like Claudia Jones, Paul Robeson, Du Bois, the later Martin Luther King, and Jackson himself, all of whom felt the sting of public sanction and opprobrium, we can observe how contemporary black officials like Colin Powell and Rice exist in a precisely inverse relationship to the long tradition of black dissidents in U.S. foreign affairs, which I've written about at some length in my recent book. Nor is it necessary only to speak in terms of political dissidents. In the context of Jackson's observation was the resignation of Andrew Young from his post as permanent U.S. representative to the United Nations in the Carter administration in 1979. Indeed, this, I would suggest, was the high watermark of civil rights movement influence on official U.S. foreign policy, and the last time that an African American held such a lofty position within a U.S. presidential administration. Young used his offices vocally and courted controversy, lauding the stabilizing effects of Cuban troops in Angola, hearkening back to his and King's participation in anti-war marches to acknowledge the UN membership of a unified Vietnam, attacking white minority rule in Rhodesia and South Africa, and criticizing Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, at that time about 40,000 settlers, or 1/10 of what it is today, as a violation of international law and obstacle to future peace in the region. You may recall that Young resigned from his position as UN ambassador in the face of public fury over his decision to meet privately with the UN representative of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, in contravention of the official U.S. no-talk policy. Young believed that if the U.S. was to play the role of honest broker in the Middle East, it had no choice but to avow an independent relationship with the legitimate political representative of the Palestinian people. According to the Los Angeles Times, this position was endorsed by 66% of Americans at that time. The former director of voter registration for SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Congress, King's organization, and at that time director of international affairs for Jackson's organization, PUSH, People United to Save Humanity, Jack Odell had already reported to Young on a visit of a delegation of Arab Americans and African Americans that he took to Lebanon to meet with the PLO earlier that summer. Upon Young's resignation from the UN, two high-profile black delegations, one led by Jesse Jackson and the other by Joseph Lowery, flew directly to Lebanon to meet with both PLO representatives and Israeli peace groups. This is all in 1979. Lowery summed up the emerging African American viewpoint. The crux of the Middle East crisis was the legacy of territorial dispossession and political exclusion of the Palestinian people, and the modest conclusion, in keeping with UN Resolution 242, recognition of Israel within pre-67 borders and a Palestinian homeland constructed on the principle that Palestinian representatives, quote, must have a role in the map drawing. These efforts, of course, resulted in no official change in U.S. no-talk policy. Moreover, the substantive foreign policy question was quickly monopolized by discussions of black-Jewish tensions at home and about the fatal fracturing of the old civil rights coalition. It is my contention that this was the last period of globally influential, independent black citizen diplomacy and foreign policy initiative. It is also significant that a quarter century later, we find ourselves in almost an identical, if not worse, situation with respect to Israel-Palestine and Middle East peace. And let me just say something as a quick aside before I say my absolute last paragraph. We have to consider the fact, I think, that the relatively uncritical U.S. support for Israel in the period since 1973 owes something to this shared settler colonial past. And you might say, I don't know if any of you saw this Mearsheimer-Walt piece in the London Review of Books. It was a very powerful argument that obviously didn't get published in any United States periodical, but you can find it on the web, which talks about the disproportionate influence of the Israeli lobby in shaping U.S. policy towards Israel. And Mearsheimer and Walt, who are, by the way, both very conservative political scientists, very conservative. I mean, they really represent a mainstream to kind of even conservative position in the U.S. foreign policy establishment. They argue in that the U.S.'s relatively uncritical support for Israel is not in the U.S. national interest. That is their basic argument, and they go through in detail a lot of examples for this. My point is not to defend their piece or even to make the same argument. My point is to say that something that they actually overlook They sort of say it's not strategically in the U.S. interest. I want to say that in order to understand U.S. foreign policy, we have to actually look at some of these cultural questions. And I would say that the connection and relationship to Israel comes from more than just strategic calculations. And it certainly comes from more than a sense of, again, this history of anti-fascism, this history of recompense for the Holocaust and the atrocities done to European Jews. It also comes from this kind of identification as people who are fighting the good fight against darkness in a land where they're surrounded by hostile natives. That's an old American script, and it's an old story, and it runs quite deep. And I know I take some risks in saying that off the cuff, but I want to say that that's kind of what I mean when I suggest that this settler colonial problem that we have actually has some quite significant ramifications. Now, in the press conference, you remember that? Okay, I don't have time to talk about that. That was held against Jesse Jackson for the rest of, well, to this day probably. That was from those Lebanon meetings. The last thing I want to just to close as a sort of coda to sort of mirror the epigraph from Condoleezza Rice. The press conference announcing his resignation, Andrew Young explained why he pursued the course of action he did, talking to the PLO, at the price of his career as a foreign policy advocate. I've tried to interpret to our country some of the mood of the rest of the world. Unfortunately, but by birth, I come from the ranks of those who have known and identified with some level of oppression in the world. And by choice, I continue to identify with what I would say in biblical terms would be the least of my brothers. With simplicity, humility, and even some old-time Christianity writ small, I think it's interesting that he says, I would say, okay? He's not talking in doctrinal terms. He's using Christianity as a tradition to inform an ethic. Now that's a different way of thinking about religion and how it could be used. Not as certainty or absolute knowledge, but as an ethical practice. And in this, I think, we might see the kernel of a post-national foreign policy project and ethos, one that rejects both the shallowness of official professions that we are now beyond race and racism, as well as the chauvinism of settler immigrant nationalism, which continues to underwrite, I think, the worst aspects of our foreign policy practice. Rooted in the other dissenting American tradition and experience, that is, the black freedom struggle, it may just be indispensable to our efforts to ensure that the 21st century is not another century of racism and war. So, thank you. And I really do apologize.